The world of modern consoles is an interesting one, with some of their processors being scaled up units which unfortunately were some of the worst things AMD ever produced. See, the main reason for this video even existing was that I recently found my old socket AM1 motherboard and processor in the shed, before turning to eBay and realising that these things, well, they aren't cheap. They're ranging anywhere from £50 to £100 from most shops online, making them rather expensive little processors, even more so given that value was one of the main things they actually had going for them since they were brand new. But before we even get started on that though, we have to take this hateful little thing reminiscent of the Xbox One inside, and make sure it still works. Right, so we've got the motherboard here with the processor on it. I think it's an Athlon 5350, one of the most powerful processors this actually all supports, and the first thing we want to do is test this works. So what are we missing? We've got the processor, we need power, and we need RAM. Let's find some RAM. We just want to test it works. No, also no. That looks modern. Stick of DDR3. Doesn't matter really on the speed, or if it matches, because this thing can only run in single channel, which is terrible. Next thing we need is a power supply. This one. And we'll connect all that up, and we'll give it cooling. That'll do. So I need to make sure it works, and then we can give it some slightly more optimistic specifications. Let's just plug it into some power. That's power. Move all the boxing. Move this off of here. Big box. Now, does it turn on? Does it turn on? Yes, it does. Have we got a display output? Well, as we can see there, we've got the Athlon 5350 with R3 graphics, running with 4GB of DDR3 at 1600 MHz, which is about standard. So I say we add another 4GB, and then we go over the specs of what is the Athlon 5350, and why do people keep buying them? Specifications wise, this is one of the best Athlon chips released on the market, other than the Athlon 5370. That was mostly an OEM special that later became available to the public and is now incredibly rare today. They seem pretty decent on paper, having released back in 2014 for less money than they cost today, but in the context of time, all that really matters is how much they cost right now. You get 4 cores clocked in at a decent 2 GHz, which doesn't sound too bad, but you have no L3 cache, and you are limited to single channel support. It's almost as if they were perfectly kept as simple as possible, and cut down in ways they really shouldn't have been. The main advantage is they use absolutely no power, and then again, cut down any chip that exists, and artificially underclock it, and you'll end up in the same boat, so even that point is relatively negligible. They come with an okay iGPU though, but given people actively recommended these up until the launch of AMD's Ryzen for more than just basic server and media center use, they really haven't aged all too well. But then again, the reason they got recommended is because they are more or less the console processors cut down, and now costing just about more than ever, how well are they holding up? After this though, we did give the system some more RAM and an even better cooler. Even if it was just taken from the Athlon sitting next to it, it's a really overkill system. And this is an absolutely best case scenario setup for this type of system. We've got 8GB of DDR3 clocking in at 1600 MHz, the overkill cooling from the Athlon PC, and a rather decent Asus motherboard, which is better than the lower end offerings of OEM junk that you'll often find up for sale. From there though, all that was left to do was run an operating system, which of course we went with a stripped down version of Windows 10, which we used last week in the Core 2 Quad PC. So we knew it ran fine in a PC that by all accounts is worse than this, and that had a processor from 17 years ago, meaning this system has absolutely no excuse to run poorly at all. Which then meant I spent about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, just tinkering around with it in its base form as an APU, before deciding that nope, we need even more upgrades to the system, and we're going to be very generous later on. But to save you some misery, I did condense that 2-hour clip down into just a couple of minutes for you to enjoy. Right, so we're going to go ahead and install these drivers, even though it looks like Windows has already done it for us. Oh, it's struggling. It's opening more than one thing here. We have drivers, we have them all working. So we've got MSI Afterburner here, they should give us an overlay. Let's give it storage drive. Yeah, we're just running a really deep loaded version of Windows 10 here, one that is extremely lightweight. We ran this on a Core 2 Quad Q6600. Let's go open up Steam. So Steam's just downloading the update there, and it's all running okay. I mean, it's dead silent. It's taken a little while to get to this point, installing drivers and things like that, but so far, not too sluggish. And it's in a best case scenario. You know, this is running off an SSD, deep-bloated Windows. We're already at 100% utilization where it's extracting a Steam package. Let's give it a second. I'm liking this big, long line. You know, I get that on my laptop when I'm rendering the videos, not when I'm opening a Steam package. We're now, I'd say, probably about 5 minutes into extracting this package. As you can see, the line has moved a little bit. And now we're just installing the update. A nice, simple task. It's taken its time. It's thinking. Oh, it disappeared. We're now verifying the install. We're still going. Oh, right, 10 minutes for Steam to open. I say open, it's not actually opened. It's just stopped loading. Right, what was that? Let me check the camera. That was 15 minutes. Now, what we'll do is if we just launch, what have we got installed? Oh, this is slow. You can watch the cursor visibly drag behind. GTA 5, relatively respectable game, ran on last generation consoles, and ran perfectly fine on the Core 2 Quad last week, which of course we picked up for £5. This of course costs over 10 times as much, but it's sold as a complete system for about that money, so by all accounts, this should work. So let's see how long this takes to load. Error. No compatible sound playback device was detected. Plugged in some headphones. The processor is already maxed out. The graphics card, doing okay at 16%. It hasn't crashed. It's just really taken its time. So we're in game. 17, 18 FPS. 17. We're talking 20-ish FPS in game. Scaling down by half. Right, so the processor can churn out a few more frames. Everything is still at about 100%, but we are seeing closer to a 30 FPS experience. I mean, it looks awful. We are currently driving into a world of nothingness, which is actually quite reminiscent of how the game runs on the Xbox One. So you can definitely see the similarities right here. This is loading in off an SSD, by the way. Oh, that is that is a scene right there. That is a scene. After trying to persist through some more testing of this little chip, we didn't make it all too much further than YouTube, which would run flawlessly, keep in mind. It would just spend an insane amount of time loading, and then had this weird bug where it would load an ad on top of your video, and it didn't matter if you used adblock or not, this would just happen. But play the audio from the video that you wanted to watch on top of the ad as well. Very strange, I've never had that happen before. Opening more than one tab proved to be an immense struggle, as even with 4 cores, none of them quite seemed to know what to do. They would spend most of their time maxed out and then just freeze the system. Something that I've only ever really seen on a Pentium 4. And I'm not saying this experience is exactly like that, because this thing really shouldn't be pipeline stalling, but it just wasn't great. Even the Budget Builds website proved almost too intensive for a system that was designed for these types of tasks. Basic animations were lagging, and when you had multiple tabs open, it was just pretty close to unusable. It was very slow, and if you could deal with that, it's okay, but for something designed for this exact situation, not great. Now, to give this thing the best possible chance of actually being alright to use, I opted to use a decent dedicated graphics card. And not just any card, we are giving this thing the most powerful lightweight card I own, the legendary Matrox C680, a DirectX 12 capable graphics card that runs even the latest games like Red Dead Redemption 2, all while having drivers so lightweight they take up virtually no CPU time at all, meaning that this thing has no excuses for running poorly from this point forward. It is an expensive processor, and currently it can't outperform even stuff we've seen that costs next to nothing. We even put it in turbo mode, which I'm not too sure if it does anything here, but it used to make a little bit of difference on my old FX series stuff, so maybe it'll do something. after a bit of tinkering, things did seem a lot better. I compared against a Radeon card, an Nvidia card, and the Matrox card, and overall things were smoothest with Matrox, purely because it wasn't taxing the processor as much, giving it a best case scenario. So we've got a lightweight operating system, the most ideal graphics pairing in the world, and things were a world apart. Still not justifying the price of itself, not one bit, but it was more usable with the web being browsable with 2 whole tabs open, and also installing software at the same time. I don't know what deserves more credit here, the Matrox card or the Athlon processor, and I'd be more inclined to say the graphics card. But then again, this processor does share a lot in common with the Xbox One and also the PS4, and if they can manage some gaming, and I mean that's all they really existed for, then we need to take a look at things in a bit of a different style of the benchmarks. Starting us off with GTA 5, as that's what we tested before we gave the system some slightly better specifications, with the Matrox card taking a load off of the processor, even when it came just to streaming in data, and those AMD drivers for the iGPU, well, they use far much more CPU time than they ever ought to, meaning that they make the processor struggle and essentially bottleneck its own iGPU. Things looked alright with the game giving you exactly what you'd expect, just Xbox One levels of performance with a relatively okayish 30 FPS during most of the single player game, so you can tell why they decide to cap this down on consoles for a smoother frame rate. Also real eye-opener that GTA 5 never really uses more than 4 cores, so over on the consoles I really can't see those being optimised to use more than 4 anyway, as anyone that's ever touched the game on PC knows that after 4 cores it never really touches them. Maybe there have been optimizations done, but here we were seeing an experience that was on par with the actual console itself, even down to the textures struggling to load in, and sometimes staying in their LOD format, or just taking a while to load. It was really the true Xbox One experience here. That was until you got onto a GTA Online server, and things, well, they still stayed the same as if you were playing on console. In a 32-player server, which is well over the 16-player cap the game should have kept, the netcode completely breaks, and as we can see, the processor can't even manage full utilization. Now, this does explain quite a lot to people that are still playing the game on console, and they're seeing this exact type of situation, because trust me, load up GTA Online on an Xbox One or PS4, and you'll be seeing something quite similar to this. And it turns out, when the netcode breaks, the processor can't even get to full utilization on 4 cores, and that is definitely more the game than the processor causing this, something that rings true over on the Xbox One. So, it makes sense here. For a game that seems to run on 4 cores here, it's likely running on the same 4 cores on console, meaning that what are the other 4 cores on the console actually doing while this is happening? Because when you're over 16 players, the netcode breaks, the optimization drops, and we saw a pretty terrible experience. So, how lovely. When you reduce that number back under 16 players, it is a bit better. Not actually smoother than single player for once, which is odd because usually online is when you're playing with so few people, but there were only a few frames here and there between them, so negligible at best, with the processor actually managing to be utilised again. It really is a strange one, but I'm glad I did this for a set of benchmarks, as it shows exactly how much of these early titles put stress on just 4 cores, and it makes you wonder what exactly are the other 4 in those consoles actually doing while this is happening, because we had the exact same experience on console as we did with the Athlon 5350, and I'm sure for those of you that play this game on console, you'll be able to see a very similar experience to what we are showing on screen now. Mount and Blade Bannerlord did run surprisingly well, and I say this because I was expecting single digits here, but this game, for all intents and purposes, does have a console port, and one that I painfully admit does run pretty good given the intensity of the game. The same frame drops occurred as the same on consoles, and we did see a good amount of utilization. Still not flawless, which explains the frame drops here and there where the processor isn't being hammered as hard as it could be, but not too bad nonetheless. The main thing we had in common was that the console and this also took an awfully long time to load, with it taking, some battles upwards of 5 minutes to get there, especially in the late game. and new troops spawning in, well, that would bring you down to single digits. So another game that seems to scale relatively well down to this hardware, but it makes sense given that they likely pulled it off on the Xbox One. So, similar performance, and it does make you wonder again, what are those other 4 cores on consoles actually doing? Now this is a weird one, because I have zero experience with RimWorld on console. I know how to port, but here on PC, the game's Unity origins mean it uses 1 core. That's all it really uses here. And we saw it last week with the Core 2 Quad, where having multiple cores didn't do anything. So it does make me question, how does this even run on console? Did they actually pull off some multi-threaded magic? In which case, please can we have that on PCs? Because you'll have to let me know down in the comments if the game runs okay. Here the game really wasn't great. During a mid-game benchmark, we used just anything. It didn't matter what you used, the game would run the same. 1 times speed, 4 times speed, the game just slowed down the frame rate without actually going any faster. So does it run like this on console? Because if so, this is more or less unplayable. I just can't see how they've pulled this off, given that here we are having an abysmal time. Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of the first titles to show a glaring level of optimization over on the console side, as here it took a long time to load. At first I assumed it had crashed, but nope, it was still loading and just taking a very long time to do so. And perhaps it's the use of DirectX 12 and the Vulkan renderer that allow the game to utilise more cores, but given how this is half an Xbox One CPU, we saw half the performance here. And I can see that with 8 cores you could cap this at 30 FPS and call it a day, with some frame drops included. But here on the Athlon, even with a Matrox graphics card doing a lot of heavy lifting, we saw a pretty unplayable experience. It still ran, and it wasn't completely unplayable if you can deal with this type of frame rate, but it didn't matter if we used DirectX 12 or Vulkan, it wasn't what I would class as playable. The C680 helped to smooth out the frame times a little bit, but the main takeaway here is that maybe we wouldn't have got such good multi-core support in recent titles if these consoles had actually come with better processors in them, as the only way they've got them to run these new titles is to really make them run on all 8 cores, as when you strip it back to just 4 cores here, well, it's not great. Over in the realm of older games, we have GTA 4, which I'd imagine was only playable on console because the game runs with the miracle that is backwards compatibility. They pulled off something amazing there. And as we saw here, the experience was the game in the mid-20s a lot of the time and suffering with constant frame drops and a lack of any utilization. Now this game is a lot older than the processor, and I know this port isn't what I would call good, but I did expect something slightly better than this, maybe being able to cap it at 30 FPS and call it a day, and maybe with some tweaks you probably could see closer to full utilization. But here we are using a full fifth of the processor, relegating titles like these to the realm of unplayability, something not uncommon with a lot of older games that can only really use 2 cores and briefly skim over any more, meaning 4 low-powered cores, it simply doesn't cut it. Skyrim Special Edition ran the same as it did on the Xbox One, with near enough a perfectly playable 30 FPS, and once again it does make you realise the basis for a lot of minimum requirements for these games until very recently was simply make the game run on console with a PC port, and ideally one that only uses 4 cores, because for the vast majority of what we've seen, that's exactly the way it's gone. Some of you may have noticed that if you have a 6 or 8 core system, Skyrim isn't really touching more than the first 4, at least not properly, and I would imagine a lot of that stems from it running at a 30 FPS target on console, so us here seeing the game use 4 cores and run at 30 FPS, it's playable, but it does explain some of the issues people have with these PC ports. And now, if you want a reason why BeamNG will never come to consoles, here is the game running at full utilization at around 15 FPS. Now I'd imagine if they figured out some magic to utilize all 8 cores, you could see twice the frame rate. But as it stands, even with the Vulkan renderer, which I found very unstable, the processor side performance increase was not at that level yet. So I'm going to say that's probably the reason why you won't ever see anything like this over on console. The game was completely unplayable, even with the simplest of tests, meaning that if they wanted to port this game at all, you'd be looking at the bare bones maps running at 20 to 30 FPS at best. And I don't call that anything resembling a playable experience, at least not one on console, where you expect at least something smooth. So yeah, the benchmarks are a bit of an eye-opener, but remember we are looking at this in the context of today, where its main competitor is its console counterpart, and it carries a price tag far higher than it has any right to. I mean, this type of setup would cost you as much as an Xbox One, and given that we are seeing worse than a Core 2 Quad, maybe even Core 2 Duo performance for over 10 times the cost of one of those, it is frankly ridiculous. I think the most interesting takeaway from this is that we can see that console optimization, well, it only kicked in once developers literally couldn't use just 4 cores, and you can't really argue with that as a result. A 30 FPS target was all they needed, and sure, with double the performance on offer over on console, it was rare that they ever seemed to have fully utilised that outside the realms of games like Red Dead Redemption 2, which literally won't work here on the Athlon with half the cores. Definitely an interesting one to think about, and in the context of today's pricing on these, downright ridiculous. But there will still be some people saying, that's not what these were for, they were for media centres and servers and all the likes, and yes, it still does that, no one is arguing with that point. But when you are spending, on average, at minimum £50 on one of these, just get something cheaper, better, or equally power efficient. People recommended these for gaming back in the day as you got the same 4 cores that made up the latest consoles, and at their price point at the time, they were sold for under £30 brand new, but they are now double that for a used one, and this is a niche use case. It's a struggle to recommend these, as there are no bad products, just bad prices, and in this case, you know, trying to justify something that only borders on the world of usability thanks to a decent niche graphics card being added with it, and when older hardware outperforms it, newer hardware is more efficient, they are stuck in a weird pricing limbo. When I polled the community now 10 years on from the launch of these processors, the response was astonishing. 30% of people said it was the worst thing on the market right now, 11% of people thought not, but the majority of people didn't even know these things existed, which is probably a good thing given the pricing. It certainly sparked some interesting conversation, with some people saying they still enjoyed using it as a low-power processor with full expandability, and I can't really argue with the novelty of all that for how cheap they were on release. But there was also a side of it that saw these not in their introduction, but later on into its life where things were quite different, and that's where they quickly became irrelevant and antiquated, and I think everyone agreed it was an odd one because for some reason it was very decent, but with prices as high as they are today and better options existing for virtually any need, AM1 finds itself in a strange situation, loved by those who had it brand new for its value, and loathed by anyone who ended up having to use it for just a few years later. The Athlon 5350, revered as the low-cost equivalent to the Xbox One itself, and today, even I have to admit myself that it's just not worth the cost. If you have one and it's working for you, that's great stuff, but unless you're getting an entire system very, very cheap, there isn't any reason to go out and look for one of these unless you want the novelty of owning one. The same way that owning a Power Mac G5 and making it into an Xbox 360 dev kit might be unique, it's just not even as nice to use as that. It's got a novel purpose, but its value has long since been lost to time, and the power it once had has long since been lost to a more modern web and more intensive games that were finally forced to start utilising literally double the power of this here processor. I hope you've all enjoyed watching this rather analytical look back at the Athlon 5350. There is still my older video on this for some more gaming benchmarks, but this was more looking at it from the, avenue of it being the console's processor. So I hope you've all enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching, and good night. I'm going to take off the cooler. Right, I am now lifting the cooler off the processor. We are still running without a cooler. This is about the only neat thing this can do. You can just lift the cooler off the top. Oh, it's struggling a little bit now. I'm going to give it the cooler back.